So today, I will be presenting some preliminary findings from an ongoing project at Indiana University, a project that's designed to study trajectories of cognitive decline using a social network framework. Given the current state of our data, we are not yet able to explicitly address issues of causation, but rather, we'd like to use this platform today to expose some of the unique ways in which egocentric network analysis can be used to highlight the nuances, social interactions, and relationships varying across levels of cognitive impairment. As such, we welcome any comments, critiques, or general feedback that may help us improve this work as we move forward. Finally, I would like to acknowledge my co-authors at Indiana University, shown here on the screen, and their collective contributions towards this work. So a logical starting point is to note the robust relationship existing between social networks and cognitive function. Countless studies across numerous contexts have repeatedly found that individuals with larger personal networks tend to exhibit higher levels of cognitive function compared to their more socially isolated peers. This relationship appears to hold true across multiple dimensions of social networks, including size, density, and network bridging, number of different social roles within a network, and the amount of support provided by network members. Of course, the obvious question remains as to the directionality of this relationship. On one hand, the social causation argument states that social networks are protective of cognitive decline. Conversely, the social contraction argument states that people's personal networks are likely to shrink as a result of preceding cognitive impairments. Although our ultimate goal is to address the directionality of this relationship, for today's purposes, we aim to expand this two-sided perspective by parsing out some of the potential underlying mechanisms between these two variables. First, we propose the etiological process. This would state that social networks build cognitive reserve by stimulating the brain through interactions with other people. This cognitive reserve, in turn, protects individuals against the harmful effects of dementia and other forms of neurodegeneration. It is consistent with the social causation hypothesis. This is contrasted by the prodromal process, which would state that cognitive impairments diminish the ability to maintain certain social relationships. This latter process aligns with the social contraction hypothesis, in that cognitive declines precede network change. But it's within this latter line of thinking that comes the important distinction between objective measures of cognitive decline and subjective measures. On one hand, objective cognitive decline occurs regardless of whether the individual is aware of it. The prodromal process would hold that objective cognitive impairments are responsible for network contraction. Subjective cognitive decline, meanwhile, refers to self-perception, and this can occur in two forms. First, an individual may feel as though they are experiencing some sort of cognitive decline. Second, this episode of decline becomes visible to other people. It's important to distinguish between these two forms of subjective cognitive decline because how they may each manifest in terms of social interactions. If in fact the individual recognizes their decline, they may intentionally abstain from certain social interactions in fear of either embarrassment or being a burden to those around them. This scenario would describe the social withdrawal hypothesis, in which we expect the ego to withdraw from interactions with alters. Conversely, if one's cognitive decline becomes readily apparent to others, this may lead to the social rejection process, in which alters are the ones withdrawing from interactions with ego. Although exploring all four of these potential processes is necessary, for the time being, we're going to be focusing primarily on these latter two. With that, we derive the following two hypotheses. The social withdrawal hypothesis states that individuals with self-assessed cognitive decline will report smaller, more restricted ego networks compared to cognitively normal individuals. You'll note here that cognitively normal is in quotation marks, and this is not to refer to those who are clinically considered cognitively normal, but rather to individuals who do not recognize that they have any impairment, whether it's there or not. Second, the social rejection hypothesis states that individuals who are identified by a secondary source as experiencing subjective cognitive decline will report smaller, more restricted ego networks compared to their cognitively normal counterparts. So we aim to test these two hypotheses using data from a larger ongoing project, which I mentioned at the beginning. This project is called the Social Networks in Alzheimer's Disease Project, or SNAD, as it's known by its acronym. It's an ongoing project led by Bria Perry, who we'll hear from tomorrow, in the Department of Sociology at Indiana University. The study goal is to understand the role of personal network dynamics in etiology and clinical progression of mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. To achieve this goal, we teamed with researchers from the Indiana Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, or the IADC, up in Indianapolis. They had an ongoing study of a cohort of older adults in which they were gathering a number of clinical measures as well as neuroimaging measures on this cohort. The SNAD takes place in two phases. In phase 1, which went on from 2015 to 2019, we interviewed 278 of the IADC participants in the clinic during their annual visit. From this, we got information on their core networks using the Important Matters name generator and a Health Matters name generator. During phase 2, which is currently still being collected, we expanded our sample to include 400 participants who are now interviewed at the home in addition to undergoing their clinical visit. In this longer interview at the home, we gather expansive network data, keeping these core network measures, but also looking at things like elastic and workplace ties. We also asked them about disruptive life events, which are hypothesized to influence their cognitive decline, as well as participation in a number of social activities. For today's purposes, we're just going to be analyzing data from phase 1. So you see that 278, that's going to be our sample, and our N is going to drop just a little bit for reasons I will explain in a moment. So the SNAD has several unique advantages despite being a clinical study. First is we have information not just on their networks, but we also have neuroimaging data and other biomarkers such as genotypes, which are useful when studying cognitive decline. Second, as I previously mentioned, we have expansive network data that's currently being collected in phase 2 that helps us look beyond the core networks that may be important for cognitive impairment. And finally, most pertinent for today's purposes, we have information from a secondary perspective. This comes from a study partner who co-enrolled with all participants starting in that initial wave. So in the previous slide, I mentioned that we're going to be analyzing that wave 1, phase 1 sample of 278 people, but that our N drops a little bit. Well, this is why. We didn't get complete information from all study partners during that first phase. So we're going to be focusing on the 145 participants from whom we also have secondary perspectives from their study partner. So to use a measure of clinical cognitive assessment, we're going to use the MOCA, or the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. This is a global assessment of cognitive dysfunction and is often used as a screener for mild cognitive impairment. Scores range from 0 to 30, in which participants are administered this face-to-face test, which they have to undergo a variety of activities, some of which are shown here, in which you have to trace dots in sequential order, name certain animals, and this sort of thing. For the subjective measure of cognitive decline, we use a measure that was created at the IADC. It takes place in two phases. First, participants are asked the following questions. Compared to 5 years ago, how would you rate your ability to? And then they're asked a series of questions such as recall new information told to you, remember things that happened to you recently, remember the names of faces, places you meet, and recall conversations a few days later. Using this Likert scale shown on the right, they give answers to all these questions and more. Then these values are summed, and then they're asked the following question. Do you feel your memory is getting worse? They can say no, yes, but it doesn't worry me, or yes, and it worries me. They choose this last answer and meet a certain threshold on that initial series of questions, then they're considered to have subjective cognitive decline. If they don't meet both those criteria, they're not considered to have subjective cognitive decline. So this latter measure is a dichotomous indicator. So moving now to the results, we can see some sociodemographic descriptive statistics using the N of 145. The mean age was 71 years, with the bulk of participants falling between the ages of 55 and 80. The mean education was just over 16 years, and it was 64% female. As for the measures of cognitive function, you can see here on the left that a minority of participants, just over 40, reported concerns of subjective cognitive decline. It's worth noting, however, that the participants themselves appeared to be more critical than their study partners were. Only 24% of the study partners believed their enrolled participant was experiencing any noticeable signs of cognitive decline. Switching focus to the quote-unquote objective accounts of cognitive function as captured by the MOCA, we see here on the right that the average score was 24.6, which is on the higher end, but we also have an appreciable range of scores across the sample. Turning now to the network characteristics, we can see that the average participant named just under 5 alters. As with most core networks, these networks were on the denser side and consisted primarily of kin. Furthermore, participants were both emotionally close and in frequent contact with the majority of their alters. So one common issue facing this type of research is finding an appropriate way to characterize networks such that they can properly be compared against different outcomes, in our case, cognitive function. As noted in the introductory slide, there's a range of network measures used across studies looking at cognitive health as both an outcome and a predictor of egocentric networks. For today's purposes, we've decided to tackle this issue by taking a holistic approach in which we group networks by overall typology. We do this by starting with all the networks in our sample, the 12 shown here is just a hypothetical, and then we assign each one of these networks to one of 2 typologies using a k-means clustering technique. This leaves us with 2 demarcated clusters, the first of which we're calling the diverse network typology. These networks are on average characterized by their lower density values, more ties to kin, and less emotional closeness and frequency of contact. The second cluster, shown on the right, we are calling the restricted network typology. These networks are characterized conversely by fewer alters, higher values of density, more kin, more emotional closeness, and more frequent contact on average. So it's with these 2 typologies that we're going to test our hypothesis regarding subjective cognitive decline. In short, we're going to assess the odds that any given participant is assigned to the diverse cluster rather than the restricted cluster based on his or her levels of cognitive impairment. So to assess the social withdrawal hypothesis, which as a reminder said that participants with self-assessed subjective cognitive decline are going to report smaller, more restricted ego networks compared to cognitively normal participants, we ran a series of logistic regressions, regressing on the odds of being in the diverse network typology. You can see here across models, the odds ratio for SCD, which is subjective cognitive decline for self-assessment, failed to reach significance even after controlling for education, sex, and age. In model 3, however, you'll see that there is a significant relationship between MOCA and the odds of having a diverse network. Moving to the social rejection hypothesis, we take the same approach, but now we use this subjective cognitive decline measure from the partner's point of view, them assessing their study participant. Although the odds ratios are lower in the anticipated direction, they still failed to reach statistical significance. Once again, however, the MOCA is significantly linked to odds of having a diverse network. So now moving to the discussion, we'll give a quick summary of our findings. First, we noticed a weak association between primary and secondary accounts of subjective cognitive decline. In other words, participants and study partners were not necessarily in agreement as to the level of cognitive decline that was occurring among the participant. Second, we found no obvious support for either the social withdrawal hypothesis nor the social rejection hypothesis. And third, we found a strong association between clinical assessments of cognitive function and network typology. These findings, of course, come with certain limitations, and from those we're going to try and move forward. The first limitation is that these are cross-sectional analyses. This is in part what stopped us from being able to test those etiological process and that prodromal process, because we only had one wave of data. There's also issues of sample size. We only had an N of 144. So this might have detected or affected our ability to detect a significant relationship with those social rejection and withdrawal hypotheses. And finally, for the time being, we only analyzed respondents' core networks. So using more expansive networks, we're going to get a larger size and different types of ties, things which have been hypothesized to be linked to cognitive functioning will help us get at this. So moving forward, we hope to address some of these limitations by, in part, investigating the etiological and prodromal processes. We'll do this by bringing in the longitudinal data from phase 2 of SNAD, which helps us look at network dynamics and trajectories of cognitive decline. And it also will allow us to look at biomarkers of neurodegeneration to test that etiological process. Finally, we are currently working on a qualitative account of tide dissolution. These are the specific reasons that participants have been giving for why they've dropped ties in follow-up waves of the data. This will help us see some of the reasons and parse out further the social rejection versus withdrawal hypothesis and see if there's any evidence of those. Finally, I'd like to give acknowledgments to some of our collaborators as well as our funding sources at the National Institute of Health. Thank you very much for watching.